I'm Cliff. I'm with the Salute America team here at UT Health San Antonio. Welcoming everybody who's joining to our webinar series, Let's Address Health Equity Together. Today's webinar is Busting the Myths and Cultural Barriers to Clinical Trials. We have, hopefully joining us soon, Dr. Emily Ramirez, who's the Director of Salute America and its home base at the Institute for Health Promotion Research at UT Health San Antonio. She's spent over 30 years directing research on human and organizational communication to reduce chronic disease and health disparities affecting Latinos. She's also Associate Director of Cancer Outreach and Engagement at NCI, designated Mays Cancer Center at UT Health San Antonio. And this is the part where I hand it off to her, but today I'm going to introduce our panelists while she gets time to arrive. Today we have Dr. Mio Kitano, an Associate Professor in Division of Surgical Oncology and Endocrine Surgery at UT Health San Antonio. Her clinical practice focuses on the surgical management, gastrointestinal tumors, and malignancies. Sandra Sivak is a patient navigator here on my team at the Institute for Health Promotion Research at UT Health San Antonio. And we hope to have Diana Lopez, a cancer survivor, but she is sick today and can't join us today. So we're going to try to play a video that Diana had made for us later. But our first speaker, who represents our webinar sponsor, Genentech, a biotech company and a member of the Roche Group, is Meg McKenzie. She works in patient inclusion and health equity in Genentech's Chief Diversity Office, and she develops strategies to drive greater inclusion of racial and ethnically represented patient populations in clinical research. So I'll kind of hand it off to you at this point, Meg. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Cliff. And thank you everybody in the audience who's there. If I could see you, I want to see you, but I know every single one of you are champions. And I'm just hopeful that you can take this information back to your kitchen table or your boardroom, because you are educators just by being here. And just I'm so thankful that Mays Cancer Center, Dr. Kitano, Ms. Sivak, and then potentially our patient coming on is able to share perspectives with you on why Hispanic representation in clinical trials is so important. I'm Megan McKenzie. I work at the Chief Diversity Office. I've been at Genentech for 18 years working in clinical research, and I've been so lucky to see tumors just melt on scans when we do find things that work. But more importantly, just the medical doctors that are serving patients in these trials are experts like Dr. Kitano, so I can't wait to hear from you. But I look forward to hearing perspectives and questions in the GChat. We sponsor health equity symposia like this. We started in 2022 because we know the barriers locally are different. What's a barrier for a patient in the healthcare system in San Antonio is different from New York, from Los Angeles, and it's very important that we bring the community together to talk about those barriers and help education. And I see all of you as amplifiers. And just briefly, I work in patient inclusion and health equity, and we embed diversity and inclusion in everything we do at Genentech along 3 pillars. So foster belonging to improve representation from our Latino and our Black employees at all leadership levels. And we have leadership programs specifically for different groups, employee groups, as well as in Advancing Inclusive Research Health Equity, a real focus on making sure that the patients who are entering our trials represent the patients who actually have the disease, because we can't assume results are generalizable to all patient populations unless we have that important representation. And toward that aim, we have things like the Health Equity Symposia, partner deeply with sites who are doing very well reaching the communities around them. And one of those is Mays Cancer Center in San Antonio, because they're very good at reaching their Latino population. And they're teaching us cultural humility and how to engage different patient populations, because we're learning, always learning in diversity and inclusion, and helping us bring in best practices. And then the third pillar, before I move it over to the real speakers in the room today, is Transform Society. So as a pharmaceutical biotech company, we have a responsibility to our community, and we have health equity innovation funds, and we also have patient giving funds. So our patient giving funds last year almost met 18 million, and we've given over 150 million in the last 10 years. And I'm really pleased to say in our health equity innovation funds, 94% of recipients on these teams receiving the funds either are a person of color or co-led by a person of color. So we're being very intentional about writing past wrongs and historical inequities. And I just am very honored today to hear from Dr. Kitano and Ms. Sivak, and I'm sure Dr. Ramirez will make it on soon. But thank you so much for everybody coming in today. And I'll turn it back over to you, Cliff.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks. Y'all are doing fantastic work. So Dr. Catano, can you kind of share with our audience how clinical trials are helping people and how clinical trials can be an important part of cancer care?
Yeah, absolutely. And first of all, I'm humbled to be here with excellent panelists, and hopefully Dr. Ramirez can also join us soon. So my name is Mio Kitano. I'm a surgical oncologist at the Mace Cancer Center, and increasing representation of underrepresented minorities has really been a passion, not just for the patient side, but also from the side of the healthcare providers, because the composition of patients who are involved in clinical trial is not what represents our actual patient population. And same thing in medicine, in healthcare, is the healthcare providers are usually skewed as far as there are much less underrepresented minorities working in healthcare system. So that's one of my passion, is to really increase the representation of minorities in both ends, in the healthcare provider side and also the recipient of healthcare system. And first I want to explain briefly what clinical trials are. So clinical trials are studies. So it's a research study to see if certain treatment works. So it's an interventional study. And I know patients sometimes ask me in clinic the different types of clinical trials. And there are also studies called observational studies, which are not actually giving treatments, but just to observe patients with certain disease condition. I'm talking about clinical trials, which is an interventional study. So we're actually providing some kind of a treatment. Often these are drug trials, but I am a surgeon, and there are also surgical clinical trials as well. And that is mostly to compare if certain treatment or intervention is better or worse than current existing treatment. And I know that some patients think clinical trials are sort of like experimental, and that I don't really like that terminology. I mean, yes, they are experiments, right? We are trying to see if they work or not, but these are the steps that we need to undergo to make sure that these interventions actually work, and then also to make sure that they're safe. So to break down the types of clinical trials, there are 4 different phases or 4 different parts. Part 1 is mostly to look at whether the intervention is safe or not, and then also to see if it's a drug clinical trial, to see what dose is the safe dose. And then it moves on to the second phase or second part, where there are more patients involved, and the second part is to see if that intervention works or not. The first part is not to see if it works. The first part is just to make sure that it's safe. And then third part is to get a much larger population, usually in the thousands. The first phase is usually less than 100, and then second phase is anywhere from 100, 500, but pretty small scale. And then third part is a much bigger scale to really see if the intervention works or not. And often it involves randomization, which means to really put patients into 2 groups. Sometimes it's the standard of treatments that already exist compared to this new treatment, or sometimes placebo, which is no treatment at all, and then compare. There's always some type of a comparison in phase 3. And I know that embarking on clinical trials can be scary, because often you have already exhausted the standard treatment. But what I really want to emphasize, and a story that I often tell my patients, is so my husband's mom, so my mother-in-law, she was diagnosed with breast cancer a couple of decades ago, and there was this drug that the drug companies were testing to see if it will work as far as preventing the cancer from coming back. And I didn't know her then. I know her pretty well now, but she took that leap of faith. And the clinical trials may not necessarily help you as an individual. That's one thing that's also important to know. But hopefully the goal is that it's going to help you, and then it's also going to help a much bigger picture, a much larger population as a whole. And this drug is Herceptin. Now it's standard of care treatment for breast cancer. And it got approved because many women, like my mother-in-law, participated in a study. And what's really sobering is when you look at the numbers of participants on clinical trials, is one of a really famous journal article called JAMA Oncology, which is a big representing study that looked at how many of these minorities are enrolled in clinical trials. It's about 10 to 15%. So about 80% of patients are Caucasians in clinical trials. And then about 10 to 15% are ethnic minorities, and then also Asians. Asians are the second most commonly involved ethnic group in clinical trials. And then third and fourth are Blacks and Hispanics. And that's not what our patient population looks like. So how can you extrapolate that certain drug or certain intervention works when they've mostly been studied on Caucasians? We don't all have the same genetic background. So every one of you, I really commend you from attending this seminar, because just like Ms. McKenzie said, you are all educators just by being here. And I really hope that every single one of you can spread the word of the importance of clinical trials, because it is to study if an intervention works or not in your own people, in your own, the people who perhaps your children, your grandchildren, your brothers and sisters, because we may not be able to know if some intervention or some treatment may work because they've primarily been studied on, other people who don't look like you. So thank you so much, everyone, for being here. And I might have gone over time now. We are a little bit off track because we didn't follow the actual outline, but yeah, and I'm more than happy to take any questions on the chat.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kitano. I don't know if anybody can hear me now.
Yes.
I apologize for having the technical issues this morning. I've had several people here in our office today, so it must be that our network is not being as effective as it should. But Dr. Kitano, thank you. And Meg, thank you for your excellent remarks. I was able to hear you all on the phone, and really appreciate both of you being so passionate about clinical trials, because we know it does make a difference in the treatment for our communities, but we need to be represented. So again, thank you very much. I'd now like to transition to Sandra. Sandra works directly with many of our Latino patients. Can you share, a little bit about what patients understand when you talk to them about clinical trials, Sandra, and share a little bit with us?
Oh, yes, of course. So hello, everyone. I am definitely honored to be here and to be able to share my experience with patients from the Latino population. I recently started working with the clinical trial study here in my department, and I've noticed that a lot of the patients that we introduce the study to are really unaware as to what clinical trials are. And this is pretty surprising to me. So I definitely try to introduce what clinical trials entail, but obviously I give a very basic approach. And any additional questions that they have, I refer them to the healthcare provider, because they, of course, have more information and more relevant information to share.
Great. Well, thank you so much. And now I'd like to ask Diana Lopez, who is a breast cancer survivor, and we're so grateful for you joining us today, Diana. Tell us a little bit about your cancer diagnosis and what challenges you faced. And then how did you end up choosing to participate in a clinical trial? So there's kind of three parts there. A little bit about your diagnosis, what challenges did you face, and how did you choose to participate in the trial?
Hey, Dr. Ramirez, it's Cliff. Diana was sick today and had to go to the doctor and is not able to be on, but I have a video to share of her. And I'm going to attempt to do that now so I can hear a little bit from Diana.
And while you bring that up, Cliff, I'm also a cancer survivor, and I could just briefly speak to that a bit. I'm a twice melanoma cancer survivor, and I first got melanoma when they didn't have a treatment for melanoma. And the first treatment was to go into a clinical trial. Very lucky now, there's a couple of treatments. I was very lucky to even work on a melanoma trial on cobimetinib, which got approved. It was actually, that story of seeing tumors melt. It was a patient was on trial. And we know, and as Dr. Catano said, this doesn't happen with all investigational products, but after a month on treatment, she responded. So we were extremely excited that we had found something in melanoma. But I was very lucky, Cliff. I had gotten diagnosed early, and probably that's an emphasis point for this audience. I was just listening to someone talking about lung cancer, and often it's diagnosed late. The earlier we can, and Dr. Catano can tell you better than me, the earlier we can diagnose folks, the better the outcomes are. And I was very early diagnosed. I went in because I had something flaky on my skin, and I'm like, what is that? It's not going away. I thought it was just, I thought it was nothing. And they're like, well, yeah, that is nothing. It's nothing. But there's something on your arm I want to take off. And it was a mole that was, a pretty big size, but it looked normal. But it was big enough where the eraser size, right? They take an eraser and say, if it's as big enough as an eraser, get it checked out. And sure enough, it was early, and I got it treated. I had no issues. And I do have probably some history in my family, Dr. Ramirez, because my mom, very important to pay attention to your family history. My mom, my grandmother, and my uncle had all had melanoma, but my mom diagnosed after me. So the second time I had it was on my foot. It was a little further along, so I didn't need to get my lymph nodes checked. And I was very lucky it had not spread to my lymph nodes. But I do have to go in every 6 months. I mean, I'm at high risk, family history. And but I will say I did listen to a very passionate physician in lung, and I can't tell you enough how he tripled down. I guess lung cancer, Dr. Catano, tell me if I'm wrong, lung cancer is the cancer that has the highest mortality because we don't have the kind of screening recommendations, and I'm simplifying here, in place that we do say for breast cancer, where you're going and doing a mammogram more often. So Dr. Ramirez, I hope you don't mind me sharing, but I know your patient was sick today. I just feel very lucky to be here and have physicians that know what they're doing, that can help guide me, and hopefully everybody can find a way to get that advice when they need it. So I'll stop there.
No, thank you, Meg. That was very important to share. And again, that early diagnosis and treatment is so important. And what we're trying to do with these webinars is to inform our public about the importance of asking if they are diagnosed with any type of cancer, is there a clinical trial for them? And that's what we want to acknowledge. So with that, I'd like to go to Dr. Catano and ask her, what do you feel is your role in playing, in introducing your patients?
Let me turn my video on. Yeah, as far as involving patients onto clinical trials, so I actually have to be honest, is I'm a surgeon and there are not that many surgical clinical trials, just because they're difficult to design and then difficult to enroll because they're having a surgery or not having surgery. So there is a term in clinical trials called equipoise, and it's a little bit of an advanced terminology for the audience, but it just means that there has to be an equivalent. You cannot be leaned towards, as a provider, as a healthcare provider, if you think one treatment works better than other, then there is no equipoise. So equipoise is when you truly don't know if one intervention or one treatment is better than the other. So every clinical trial has to have equipoise, that gray area where you don't know if it works or not. If not, then it's not a clinical trial, right? And ethically, we cannot do a clinical trial that there is no equipoise. So it's surgical trials, it's just a little bit more difficult to have equipoise, just because the magnitude of the intervention, it's surgery. But there certainly are clinical trials. And there are two things that I try to do as far as encouraging patients on getting involved into clinical trials. First of all, I know the clinical trial office people pretty well, and also the medical oncologists who are involved in clinical trials. I am a member of the GI site clinical trial approval body. So we go through all the clinical trials that are currently available at Mace Cancer Center. So I sit on that committee as well. So just by knowing which clinical trials are available, I'm able to triage and navigate patients and kind of recommend them which oncologist they should see. So that's one thing I can do as a surgeon, is to try to help patients just by having the knowledge and education what's available out there. And then another thing is, if there is nothing available at the Mace Cancer Center, there's so many clinical trials ongoing across the nation, especially at the NIH, at the National Cancer Institute. So it's easy enough to find the current ongoing clinical trials just by going to clinicaltrials.gov. It's a website that shows all the list of clinical trials that are happening across, not just across the nation, but even internationally. So sometimes I log on, and when the patient has exhausted treatments and there's nothing available at the Mace Cancer Center, I try to really help and facilitate the patient get involved into clinical trials, perhaps at other sites. And I was actually heavily involved in clinical trials at the NCI when I was in training. I was there for 3 years. So I still know some people, and I try to get them onto clinical trials there whenever I can, if there is nothing available that we have to offer at the Mace Cancer Center. And then second part is the educating the patients, right? Talking to patients what clinical trials are about. And also one of my other passions that I said earlier is to really increase the representation of healthcare providers. And I sit on the committee for the Women in Surgery Committee, as well as Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee for the American College of Surgeons. And then I also sit on the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee for the Association for Academic Surgery. So that's an area of passion where I'm trying to increase the representation of underrepresented minorities in the healthcare system and the surgical care system, because I'm a surgeon, but because patients really want to really talk to doctors that look like them and really understand their culture, and also even talk to providers that may not necessarily look like them, but have that cultural humility, have the ears to listen to them, to their concerns and their cultural beliefs. So I'm trying to really change the face of healthcare, not just the recipient of care, but also the providers of care, and also increase awareness by trying to provide education to patients.
Thank you. No, we are so grateful that you're part of our team and here at the Mace Cancer Center to help really promote clinical trials. And as you well know too, what in your opinion are some of the biases that some of our providers may have that they need to overcome when they might offer a clinical trial to a patient?
Yeah, thank you for that question. And yeah, I think the main thing is, and not just healthcare provider, every human being, we have this reaction, this act called implicit bias, where we judge an individual even without thinking. It's not a conscious decision, but it's something that really unconsciously happens in our back of our heads. And we, some of the examples of a healthcare provider not wanting or not offering or educating patients on clinical trials is the provider may think, oh, that person is not educated, so may not be interested in clinical trials, or these assumptions may just graze through in the back of their head and not necessarily talk to their patients about the available clinical trials. So this is a really great, it's one of the examples, the implicit bias, where the provider. So there are multiple steps in involving a patient through clinical trials. One is the provider knowing what's available. So that's really important. So, and then second is actually talking to patients of what's available. And then the third is, actually educating and have to give all the available options, including standard of care, and then also clinical trials. And then fourth, that's also really, really important in order to involve patients into underrepresented minorities into clinical trials, is to really understand the cultural background of our patients, which I think that's an area that we all need to work on. So unless we have those 4 things, the patients are not going to be part of clinical trials, right? If we don't know what clinical trials are available out there, we can't involve them into clinical trials. And then so that, having that training, I think, and that's what Genentech, Ms. McKenzie's group is doing really well, is to overcome the implicit bias part on the healthcare providers, really educate the healthcare providers so we have cultural humility, so we understand where these patients are coming from when they decline or show very little to no interest in clinical trials. That makes us kind of think, okay, wait a minute. Are they not interested because they don't understand, or are they not interested because is it something that they are afraid of? Or, it really helps become more, have more empathy and more ears to listen to their concerns, rather than just when the patient says, oh, I'm not interested, and just kind of move on to the next patient. It really helps us become a little bit more engaged and really try to understand where these patients are coming from, and be more involved in this whole education part, because without really having that knowledge, knowledge is power, right? So you have to really, it gives us the ability to talk to the patients, to be more involved in clinical trials.
Great. No, and perfect. And that really a great, talking about education is so important. And this is a great question for Sandra. Sandra is introducing, educating our population about clinical trials and in a behavioral intervention that we are doing. So Sandra, how do you introduce clinical trials as a possibility with the patients that you see at the clinic?
So the first thing I do whenever I enter a patient's room is I try my best to read the room. I look for cues that tell me where the patient is, how comfortable they are with me. I try to first build that trust, and then I ask questions. I ask if they've ever heard of clinical trials, if they've ever participated in clinical trials before. That way I can kind of prime myself for how I should approach. And I feel like that served me very well as far as all the patients that I have met with. And I always encourage questions. If I'm also bilingual, so so if I see that they're not understanding me as best as I feel that they could understand me, I'll make sure to ask, would you like me to say this in Spanish, or vice versa. It's just a matter of making sure that they are on the same page with me whenever I'm explaining these things. And if I have to elaborate further, then so be it, I'll elaborate.
Great. What are some of the maybe strangest things you've heard people tell you about their concerns or fears about clinical trials?
So one of the things that I have heard, and this one did take me by shock, was that I had a patient that was scared that she was injected with something, and it was a simple blood draw. And she called our office, and she was speaking with one of the staff members, and she was just in a chaotic state saying, I'm sick. What did y'all do to me? And it definitely did take a minute to talk her down. This wasn't a study that had to do with clinical trials, but it was more one of the educational ones. But just seeing that, she felt, or she was scared that we had done something to her from the research side, that kind of gives me more insight to what these individuals, like how these individuals perceive us, that there's just that lack of trust and what they feel we may be capable of doing.
Great. Thank you so much. And, those are some of the concerns, and again, that we try to overcome with education about what clinical trials are with our patients, because we definitely that their outcomes, their health outcomes are the most important thing that we want. We want to offer them the best treatments possible. So, and so with that, Meg, I'd like to ask you, you know, we are extremely proud of the partnership that we've developed with Genentech. And how did Genentech decide that they really wanted to address diversity in clinical trials? Why did it become such a major focus for Genentech?
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Ramirez. You know, we get very excited when we've created something that actually meets a patient's need, and we really want that to be available to everyone. But when you don't have representation in the clinical studies that are determining, you know, what's safe, how it works, how efficacious it is, you can't assume that that result is generalizable to the populations that were included in it. And there are a lot of social, as you know, a lot of social drivers of health. It's really important that we understand the full patient, their exposure to different things. And if we have a very homogeneous population, if patients are all a European ancestor, they're all white, you just can't assume those results are the same for our Black or Latino patients. And, you know, from a scientific lens, we could very well be missing signals. So we have an example of a lung cancer drug called Tarceva in early phase trials. It was an EGFR inhibitor, and it was working fine. But as Dr. Katana said, there's often a comparator, or there's a standard of care in the trial. It's doing like the standard of care, and you don't have a drug to give people if it's doing the same as the standard of care. But one patient, an Asian woman, was a super responder. She was 100 times responder than all the other patients in this small trial. I don't know if folks know this, but most phase 1 trials don't go forward. We either don't get the dose high enough, or we don't feel it's working well enough. But this one patient caused the researchers to look, and they found 2 novel alleles that were special in her. That happened to be in other patient populations, but is more common in Asian women. And it allowed us to go forward. One person made a difference in making this drug go forward that's now used in lung cancer. So you don't know what you don't know. And we really need to just from an ethical standpoint, we need to represent all patients who have the disease we're studying to make sure we're being inclusive. So there are business reasons to do it, there are ethical reasons, and there's scientific reasons to do it. It's the right thing. Thankfully, everybody is looking how to do this better. But I think I could double down on the trust concern that Sandra said. I mean, this rebuilding of trust, I mean, big companies, right? People think of pharma biotech, and they think of big companies. And try to think of people like us who are like dedicating their lives for patients and for our families and for our moms and our dads. We're in it for patient health, and we have a ways to go to rebuild that trust. And I'll stop there, but I've been very thankful to Mays Cancer Center because you have co-created with us educational videos about why inclusion is important. And I think you understand your communities, and you're helping to build trust so that all your patients have the choice. They have access to a trial if they should choose to do that with their doctor. Hopefully that answers your question.
Thank you. You did. No, thank you so much, Meg. And again, just reaching out to the Latino community. You know, I've been working in this area for a number of years now. And the reason it's so important is that the Latino community or Hispanic community, we're kind of complex because we represent a tremendous amount of ancestry in terms of anywhere from European to Central African to Native American. And so that mixture of within us is important for researchers to know about so that treatments are more effective. We know, for example, our Hispanic children with leukemia are not benefiting as much from current medications, and we don't know why. For most population groups, the current leukemia medications are working well, but not for our children. And so this is why, again, more research is needed, more diversity in clinical trials, so that when a drug does come out, we know that it's applicable to the majority of the population. And Latinos now are representing 20% of the US population, but less than 4 to 5% in different types of clinical trials. So it's extremely important. So Sandra, tell us a little bit about the work that you all are implementing at Mays Cancer Center, and why is that important?
So the study that we are working on right now, it's called the Choices Study. And this study has a few components, but the main goal of the study is to inform patients on what exactly clinical trials are. This way it can empower them when they're at that point that to make a decision about treatment options. It's really important to understand this is a very, very delicate time in their lives. And this is one of the things that makes it very hard to approach these patients is that, they're scared, they're in a state of shock. And it's really hard for an individual to make an informed decision when they feel like they're basically on the spot. So we want to make that a little easier and empower them to make that decision because that's what they truly want. And if they don't, that's okay. But we just want them to have that information available to them.
Great, thank you so much. And again, that goes back to the remark that Dr. Catano said, the importance of educating our community. And we've tried different approaches. We know that cancer in the Latino community is a fearful term, and so many people prefer not to talk about it. But if we should be, one of the individuals who end up being diagnosed with cancer, what we really want to do is to educate our patients and become informed, so that they can have, that fruitful discussion with their provider to see if the clinical trial is the right thing for them. We also know that many of our patients feel like it's not a decision they can make on their own, and they invite their families to come in and help them make that decision. Dr. Catano, have you had any experience in dealing with a Latino patient bringing in several family members for consultation? Can you share your experience?
Yeah, absolutely. And not just for, clinical trials. Yes, pretty much, all my patients are encouraged to bring their family members to their consultation in my clinic. Both, just like Sandra said, is getting involved in clinical trials are a big life decision. It's about your life, right? It's like almost buying a house. I think it's a huge decision. So it's not a decision that should be taken lightly. And I highly encourage patients to really consult with their family, sometimes best friends if they don't have a good family support. And, sadly, some of our patients don't have good family support. The majority of our Latino and Hispanic patients have really supportive, big family dynamic. And also some of our Asian communities, sometimes they don't like to talk about their disease and condition, and ultimately their family members make the decision for them. So you really have to gauge the dynamic within the family members to really make sure that the decisions are made for a safe decision is made, and also what's best, what's best for the patient's outcomes. So that is highly encouraged. And another thing that I encourage my patients for both clinical, for surgical purposes and as well as for clinical trials is when it comes to a big decision making, I often tell my patients to go get a second opinion by another physician. I think a lot of doctors, especially surgeons, have a big ego and they get offended when patients go see another surgeon. But I actually highly encourage it because it's not when it comes to cancer and when it comes to making a big life-changing decision, it's not about me. It's about them. It's about their life and their well-being. So yeah, I tell them, they can get a second opinion, third opinion. I even give them names and numbers of the people they should see, because the decision-making is not something that can be done overnight. And that's also another thing is the clinical trial coordinators at Mays Cancer Center are excellent in talking to patients and give them information about the particular, they give a, 10-20 page consent form, where it gives all the description of what the clinical trial is about, and they're not expected to make that decision that day. They can go home, take that packet home, read about it, show it to their family, and really decide with time to see if they want to be involved or not. So that's something that's important, is to, that word education comes up over and over again, but it's really important to educate and also important to give the patients time to decide. We can't tell them, okay, you have to decide before the end of this visit. And then the third is to give that support, encouragement and support that they can talk to their family members, and that they can also talk to other healthcare providers. And I think that's not emphasized enough, that they should seek second or third opinion when it comes to their life-changing decisions.
Thank you so much. I have another question for you, Meg. How did Genentech decide that they wanted to get involved with different healthcare systems to increase knowledge and attitudes and behaviors around clinical trials? And what kinds of things are you doing now?
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Ramirez. We realize we've got to get outside of our bubble, right, to understand what the difference, the barriers and challenges are for patients and for providers. And some of that work you're aware of, we're partnering with sites who are doing very well reaching their communities around them. Mays Cancer Center is one of them, and it's an Advancing Inclusive Research Site Alliance, just to learn what can we do differently. And some of the things that you and other sites have told us of the importance of promotores and patient navigators. I mean, all of us know how difficult it is to navigate the healthcare system. And then on top of that, if you're doing a clinical trial, additional procedures and the importance of those. So some of those ways, Dr. Ramirez, is we've decided in every visit and every budget, we have enhanced patient support to help sites bring in folks who can help support patients, like hold their hands during infusions, or logistically find social support and financial support. Some sites are already doing this, but not all sites have patient navigators. Like Mays has patient navigators. And then also through our giving, Dr. Ramirez, like at University of Merced, has a promotores program, and they are working with the med school to bring the promotores in to actually build, we talk about unconscious bias or implicit bias, Dr. Quintana was talking about, but to build a cultural humility around working with Hispanic populations. And then they're actually, the promotores group is hosting med students for internships in the summer. So those are some of the ways, but we're also partnering with Univision at healthcare fairs, reaching patients, directly for screening and co-sponsoring events like that, trying to be much more intentional about getting involved with Latino and Black communities, as well as policymakers involved with the Hispanic Caucus, where there's thousands of Congress members talking about the importance of access to diagnostics, access to trials, access to insurance. So all part of a healthcare ecosystem. I hope that answered your question.
Yes, no, thank you. And it is part of an ecosystem. And, here in South Texas, anywhere from 25 to 30% of our patients don't have health insurance. And we're so fortunate to be able to work with many safety net organizations and our patient navigators to help bridge that gap, because that's one of the biggest questions that sometimes patients, tell us, I'd rather not know I have cancer because I can't afford the treatment. And so that we need this more cohesive approach in getting our different industries working together so that we can address, many of our patients' social determinants of health, whether it's financial issues, transportation issues, or just not having that right medical insurance to be able to get some of the initial tests that are required prior to participating in a clinical trial. So these are some things that we're excited. We just received a large grant from the American Cancer Society to begin addressing some of these social determinants of health. And this is how we will bring better health equity to our population here in South Texas. And I like to remind everybody that the reason we need to be inclusive of Latinos in research and in Hispanics is because we are Texas will be in 10 years for the rest of Texas and in 20 years for the rest of the U.S. And so we continue to need that representation. For the longest time, we tend to be a younger population, but there are a number of risk factors that are increasing our susceptibility to getting cancer. Obesity, for example, is something that's really facing many of our patients. And Dr. Quintana, maybe you can share with a little bit. My understanding is sometimes if a patient is too heavy, some of the treatments that are available to them may not be as effective because of their weight concerns. Can you share anything about that?
So my specialty is surgery. So I don't know any. Well, so some of the drugs are stored in fat, so in lipid or fat tissue, and there may be less of the drug availability or circulating in the blood system. But I'm not an expert, so I'm gonna have to defer that question perhaps to more of a medical oncologist. But as a surgeon, so we know that obesity is an epidemic, not just in South Texas, but in the entire country. And obesity is directly linked to certain cancers. That's it's now considered a risk factor for cancer, for instance, for breast cancer. So we actually have, we counsel our patients for weight loss programs, refer them to a dietitian. It is really important for patients to maintain a healthy weight after surgery, not just for general health, like high blood pressure, diabetes, or other healthcare issues associated with obesity, is that it can also increase certain cancers like breast cancers from coming back. So it's really important to emphasize the importance of maintaining a healthy weight. And I don't really know the specific as far as enrolling patients onto specific clinical trials due to weight limitation, but I know that there are certain drugs that are either have to be restricted or dose adjusted because of their obesity, because the drug just, the availability in the blood is less reliable for those who are obese, for certain drugs that are just stored in fat.
Great, thank you so much. And you brought up another important point, something that I know that at the national level is being addressed with regards to clinical trials, that sometimes the participation in a clinical trial criteria might be too limiting. If certain patients have comorbidities, such as you just mentioned, high blood pressure or diabetes or obesity, that this might keep them out of being eligible for a clinical trial. Can you say anything about that?
Yeah, absolutely. We know that those healthcare or health issues, I should say, diabetes, hypertension, sometimes liver issues that are related to obesity, like fatty deposit that can lead to cirrhosis. I mean, some of those are exclusion criteria, meaning that those patients with multiple medical issues may not be able to participate into clinical trials. And that's a huge issue because those medical issues disproportionately affects people with less access to healthcare because of less, for instance, preventative care. So certain things, health conditions can be well controlled and honestly completely prevented if you have access to good healthcare. So that alone, access to healthcare skews who is eligible for clinical trials. Generally speaking, clinical trials try to enroll patients are by in general healthy, right? Because we don't want complications with the clinical trials that gives us a false outcome or false results that says we are not sure if the patients had complications because they were unhealthy to begin with. So that's why a lot of the clinical trials don't like enrolling patients who are unhealthy and who are, quote unquote, unhealthy or have a lot of health issues. Those are the underrepresented minorities who have less access to care. So it's just like Ms. McKenzie was saying, it's a whole big ecosystem that is kind of hard to tease out. Maybe the patients are not enrolling into clinical trials because the underrepresented minorities are not being part of clinical trials because of the implicit bias from part of healthcare providers, or because they're not eligible because they're so unhealthy because they don't have access to healthcare. And it's just, we can really keep on talking about this and get into a rabbit hole of, there is no simple solution because we have to look at the entire global picture of who is eligible, as who can be enrolled, and also who has access to good healthcare, and also people who may go to safety net hospitals or go to the emergency room for their primary healthcare, is that they are not going to talk about clinical trials, right? So it's just it's a whole big picture that we need to eventually address. So I was starting to get into this rabbit hole, but I hope that answered your question.
You did. Thank you so much, Dr. Catano. And
Dr.
you're so
Ramirez,
right.
we have some
Yes.
chat questions that I
Okay.
want to propose to the panelists if you have a minute. We got one
Yes.
good question on how are patients involved in developing clinical trials? Does anybody have an answer for that one?
I mean, I have a brief answer. So most clinical trials, and the ones that are familiar with, are these cooperative clinical trials. They're a group called SWOG or Alliance, or they're a big body, kind of a centralized body that allocates different institutions to participate into clinical trials, and they usually have a patient advocate. So patients who have that condition, or patients who've had cancer, they sit on the panel to decide which to really help with the design, and also to see if that clinical trial should move forward. So yeah, most major clinical trial bodies have a patient advocate.
And how has a CBPR, community-based participatory research approach, how has CBPR been considered for education and inclusion of participants?
I can answer a little bit. Dr. Ramirez probably could too, but just even from a recent example, Dr. Ramirez and Dr. Talele and their staff have helped us co-create some of those videos, Cliff, that you put into the chat, and those are made with patients and their voices. We know how important it is to listen and understand barriers directly from the patient. We, like Dr. Catano said, we at Genentech, we have patient advocacy group relationships, over 200, who really represent their patients and can advocate for things that are important for them. So we bring advocacy groups, and we have maybe 20 councils to bring them in to give us feedback on programs, new programs that we're bringing in. And then some of our teams actually have dedicated, because we are dedicated to improving Black and Latino representation, specifically like a recent MS study with that we had about 15 patients who identified as Black and 15 who identified as Latino to guide the study in making sure we're being culturally competent. So we're learning a lot from patients. Even one patient can really impact our protocol authors, because they remind them that things are not as easy as we think. Like even getting urine, if you're wheelchair bound, you might be able to get urine every hour, but you can't maybe do other things. So I think we need to do more, though. I think it needs to be more integrated, that community-based approach all along the way. We could do better.
I agree.
Yeah.
Meg, thank you. Those excellent comments, and we do need to do more. And actually, now at the federal level, we are being told that we need to do more. We learned a lot from COVID in terms of how the community needs us to be more upfront and involve them as a part of the solution. And so here at our own cancer center, we are now developing some what we're calling community design studios, where we're inviting community members. We're going to provide them with education and a kind of a one-on-one about what is cancer, but then have them relate with our cancer researchers to say, yes, we like this part of your research, but have you thought about X, Y, and Z, to make that more amenable to our communities. So it's really important to get the voice of the community in any kind of design project that we might be coming up with. And so, again, sharing this kind of information with the public, with our community partners is extremely important. So no, that's I appreciate it, and it's extremely important that we continue to have them involved. Another question, Cliff?
Yeah, this one might be more for Sandra or you, Dr. Ramirez. What are some ways that you have found that best address the myths that patients have about clinical trials when you're working directly with a patient?
I can
Dr.
answer.
Sandra,
Yeah, I can give my my answer to this. So basically, as it's been said and stressed by the panelists today, is that you have to listen to what they're saying and ask questions, pry more into why they have this belief. And I think just showing them that you care enough to hear what they have to say will make them open up and just be more honest with you. That way you can take what they say little by little and, you know, just try to mitigate their thoughts, their thought process. But I mean, I honestly, listening is the most important thing, and showing that you are there for them and showing your compassion. I feel like it goes a long way. Okay, Dr. Ramirez.
Exactly.
And
Yeah,
if I
thank
could, yeah, just chiming a little bit, is also getting interpreter services and really talk to them in their first language is, I can't emphasize enough. And I am very fortunate. I am equally fluent in Japanese, Spanish, and English. So I can talk to them in their, you know, for the Latino population, I can talk to them in their first language. But there are actually some clinical trials that exclude people whose primary language is not English. The consent form clearly says the primary language has to be English. And that was couple of decades ago, and I think that's actively changing, and I'm happy about that. And that's when I was, my time when I was at the National Cancer Institute, that because you know, getting an interpreter service, it's one extra step, right? But we need to take that extra step because we need to really represent our patient population, and in order to educate, we need to be able to speak to them in their first language.
Yes, and that was actually one of the things that we found here in our own Mays Cancer Center several years back. And so we offer that service to any of our researchers, that we will help translate their informed consent and their instruments so that they can make it their trials available to a larger number of individuals. But yes, I just wanted to confirm what Sandra said, the importance of listening and building trust. And communicating in a not only in the language, but in the simplicity of that we can to help our patients better understand what are clinical trials. And I think we have time maybe for one more question, Cliff, if we have it.
Yeah, we had Meg wanting to bust one last myth before we end. Meg, do you want to go?
And Dr. Ramirez, please tell me if this is incorrect. I was talking to Ken Gatz, who's an amazing researcher at Tufts University. He told me only about 15% of clinical research studies have a pure placebo, which means like a sugar pill, meaning and if you have patients in 1, 2, or 3 arms, there'll be the investigational agent plus standard of care or versus standard of care, not versus nothing. In the case that I mentioned where I had melanoma before there were treatments, there might have been just the investigational agent versus what we would standardly do for someone with melanoma. But I didn't get a research article, but he said 15%. So this fear around I'm going to get nothing, I'm trying to address that, but also just this doubling down on the medical experts that are seeing you. We know when people are diagnosed faster, when they're treated faster, if something's not working, they're switched to something other faster, outcomes are much, much better. And anyway, that was it. Yeah. I don't know if you want to bust that one or add to that, Dr. Ramirez.
Thank you so much. No, that was a good point to make, and that is getting less and less. And I guess what I would like to see, because of my own background, is more prevention trials so that more people can actually participate. You know, again, where either you get the standard of care or the current the treatment available. But no, thank you for bringing that up. I'd like to maybe just ask each one of you one last statement of what would you like people to go away with today? Just very short, less than 20 seconds. So let me start with Sandra, Dr. Quitano, and Meg.
I just want individuals to know that are here that whenever you are working with a patient, so see them as you would see family, treat them as you would treat family. I feel this goes a long way. And that's what I have to share.
Thank you. Dr. Quitano.
Yeah, once again, I want to thank every single one of the panelists, as well as every single one of the attendees of this session. education is key, and we're all here to educate each other. I've learned some things, just sitting through on the panel. So we need to really improve the care of our Latino and population by really educating each other. So thank you for having me.
Yeah, I
Thank
echo
you.
that. Thanks. Yeah, thank you so much. Thanks to everyone. I've really learned a lot from all of you. Thank you for the audience. I have to say, patients are empowered. You don't hesitate to ask your physician, what are the clinical studies I might be interested in? That doesn't mean you're committing. Just know what's available to you. And if you could do one thing, start one of those videos that Cliff put in. We co-created it with Mays and other centers. And in lay language, it talks about double blind and comparator. And it's an animated video. It's fun. Dr. Ramirez and Dr. Talela did a great job making sure we had great representation. But thank you all for being here. Thanks for having me.
No, thank you very much. Thank you to all your panelists. You all were wonderful. Thank you for moving quickly without me being able to log on. And thank you to the audience for joining us today. I hope you'll stay tuned. We have a couple more sessions going on. And Cliff, I don't know if you have a date to promote for the next one, but if not, we will certainly get that information out to you. I'll take it back to Cliff.
Yes, thank you. Our next webinar will be on April 5th on biospecimen donation, and we'll send an invitation to everyone who signed up for this webinar today. So that's all I've got. Thank you, Dr. Ramirez.
Thank you, everybody. Have a great day. Take care.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.